Welcome, Dark Night Tales. Tonight's story is not just about escape, it's about a mother who defied the impossible. In the slave holding south of Alabama, where even a single attempt at freedom could mean death, Sallie Crane escaped not once, not twice, but 3 times. And each time, she made a choice few could survive. She returned, not for herself, but for her children. This is the true story of courage, terror, and a love stronger than chains. In early 19th century Alabama, slavery was not just a labor system. It was an industry built on fear, surveillance, and absolute control. Vast cotton plantations stretched across the state, powered by the forced labor of enslaved Africans and their descendants. Every movement of an enslaved person was monitored. Bells marked the beginning and end of workdays. Patrols hunted runaways through swamps and forests, and laws stripped enslaved people of legal identity. They were property, bought, sold, inherited, and punished at will. For enslaved women like Sallie Crane, the cruelty cut even deeper. They were expected to work the fields from dawn until darkness, endure physical violence without recourse, and still fulfill roles as caretakers, cooks, and breeders for future labor. Motherhood under slavery was a constant terror. Children could be sold at any moment, sometimes before they could even speak. Families were not protected by law. Love had no legal standing. Alabama's plantation system thrived on this destruction of family bonds. Enslaved mothers were deliberately kept powerless, knowing that fear for their children was the strongest chain of all. Overseers used separation as punishment, threatening to sell children south to break resistance. Escape was nearly impossible. Alabama's geography worked against fugitives, with dense forests, rivers, slave catchers, and informants waiting for rewards. It was within this brutal system that Sallie Crane lived and suffered. Her body belonged to others. Her children were never truly hers, and freedom was considered a crime. Understanding the violence and control of Alabama's plantation system is essential to understanding just how extraordinary Sallie Crane's defiance truly was, because escaping once was nearly unheard of, and escaping 3 times was almost unimaginable. For Sallie Crane, slavery was not only chains and forced labor. It was the daily agony of being a mother with no rights over her own children. From the moment her children were born, they legally belonged to the same system that owned her. She could raise them, feed them, and love them, but she could never protect them. Every sunrise carried the fear that this day might be the one they were taken from her forever. Sallie worked long hours under constant supervision, likely moving between the cotton fields and domestic labor, her body exhausted but her mind never at rest. Even while bent over the fields, her thoughts were on her children, whether they were safe, whether they had eaten, whether an overseer's anger might fall on them in her absence. Enslaved mothers were often forced to leave infants in crude nurseries or in the care of older children, knowing sickness or punishment could come at any moment. The threat of separation was deliberate and relentless. Slaveholders understood that a mother's love was a powerful force, so they used it as a weapon. A child could be sold to pay a debt, given away as a wedding gift, or sent to another plantation as punishment for a parent's resistance. Sallie lived with this terror daily. Each time her children were called away by an overseer, her heart likely stopped, fearing it might be the last time she would see them. Yet within this cruelty, Sallie's identity as a mother became her strength. She taught her children to stay quiet, to observe, to survive. She whispered comfort at night after backbreaking days, offering protection in the only ways she could. Her love became an act of resistance. Silent, dangerous, and unbreakable. It was this unbearable contradiction, loving children she was never allowed to keep. That planted the seed of defiance in Sallie Crane. Freedom was no longer just a dream for herself. It became a necessity for her children's survival. And it was this bond, forged in fear and love, that would later drive her to risk everything, not once, not twice, but 3 times, to escape the system that tried to erase her motherhood. Sallie Crane's first escape was not a sudden act of recklessness. It was a moment born from desperation. After years of watching her children grow under the shadow of sale and separation, the weight of bondage became unbearable. Alabama's plantations were tightly controlled, and escape meant risking torture or death, but staying meant something worse: the slow certainty of losing her children forever. At some point, Sallie made a decision that many never dared to make. She ran. Her escape likely happened under cover of darkness, when the fields were silent and patrols less visible. She would have known the dangers well. Slave catchers armed with whips and guns, bloodhounds trained to follow her scent, and harsh terrain of forests, rivers, and swamps that swallowed the unprepared. With no maps and few allies, Sallie moved guided only by instinct, fear, and the fragile hope of freedom. But the system was designed to crush such hope. Sallie was captured, whether betrayed by an informant, tracked by dogs, or exhausted by the land itself. Capture was only the beginning. In Alabama, punishment for escape was meant to be public and brutal, a warning to others who might dream of freedom. Sallie likely endured violent beatings, confinement, and humiliation. Her body was punished, but just as devastating was the psychological cruelty. As retribution, enslavers often threatened or punished children. When a mother ran, Sallie would have been forced to face the terror that her escape attempt placed her children in even greater danger. She may have been told they would be sold, separated, or harmed if she ever tried again. These threats were calculated to break her spirit and bind her more tightly than chains ever could. Yet something unexpected happened. Instead of crushing her will, the brutality hardened it. Sallie survived her punishment. She returned to forced labor scarred, watched more closely than before, but no longer believing obedience would save her children. The first escape taught her a cruel truth. The system would never show mercy, only force. That failed attempt marked a turning point. Sallie Crane had crossed an invisible line. She had tasted the possibility of freedom, even briefly, and endured the worst consequences imaginable. And still she lived. From that moment on, escape was no longer an unthinkable dream. It was a plan waiting for another chance. After Sallie Crane was recaptured, her suffering entered a darker phase. Enslavers believed that pain could erase the desire for freedom, so punishment was deliberate, prolonged, and meant to break both body and spirit. Sallie would not have been punished in private. Discipline was often carried out in front of other enslaved people, turning her pain into a warning. This is what happens when you run. She likely endured severe whippings, restraints, and periods of confinement with little food or rest. Iron shackles, wooden stocks, or isolation in crude holding spaces were common methods used to ensure obedience after escape attempts. Every blow carried a message. She did not belong to herself. Even her suffering was owned. But physical pain was only part of the punishment. Surveillance became constant. Sallie's movements were watched closely. Her labor increased, her ability to see her children restricted. Enslavers understood that hope was dangerous, so they worked to isolate her from it. She may have been assigned harsher work or placed under particularly cruel overseers to remind her daily of her place. The greatest cruelty, however, was psychological. Threats against her children would have been relentless. She may have been told they would be sold if she disobeyed again, or deliberately separated from them for days or weeks to deepen her fear. For a mother in bondage, this was torture without leaving scars, forcing her to imagine horrors she could not stop. And yet, Sallie survived. Survival itself became an act of resistance. She learned to endure pain without surrendering her resolve. She listened, observed, memorized patrol patterns, and studied the behavior of those who controlled her. Beneath forced obedience, her mind remained free. Each punishment taught her something new about the system, its weaknesses, its routines, its overconfidence. By surviving capture and punishment, Sallie Crane proved something even her enslavers failed to understand: fear could wound her body, but it could not extinguish a mother's purpose. The system believed it had broken her. In truth, it had only trained her for what would come next. Sallie Crane's second escape was far more dangerous than the first, because this time she ran knowing exactly what awaited her if she failed. The scars on her body were constant reminders of the punishment she had already survived. But so were the changes around her. The threats against her children grew louder, more specific. Sale was no longer a distant fear, it was becoming imminent. Unlike her first attempt, this escape was driven by urgency, not hope. Sallie understood that time was running out. Enslaved children were most often sold when they became old enough to work or when an owner needed money. Every passing day increased the risk that her children would be sent away forever. Waiting was no longer an option. Her second escape would have required careful calculation. She may have waited for a storm to cover her tracks, chosen a route that avoided known patrol paths, or relied on whispered information shared among the enslaved, dangerous knowledge passed in fragments and silence. Trusting anyone was a risk, yet isolation was even more deadly. This time, Sallie likely traveled farther, pushing her body beyond exhaustion. Hunger, cold, and fear followed her step by step. She knew slave catchers would be relentless, especially with a repeat escapee. Bounties increased for those who ran again, and patrols took personal pride in recapturing defiant fugitives. When Sallie was captured again, the consequences were even harsher. Repeat escapees were labeled unmanageable. Punishment escalated and mercy vanished. The goal was no longer correction, it was destruction. And still, Sallie endured. What made this second escape different was what it revealed to her. Running alone was not enough. Freedom without her children was not freedom at all. Each failed attempt sharpened her understanding of the system and clarified her purpose. Escape was no longer just an act of rebellion. It was part of a larger mission. By surviving her second capture, Sallie Crane stood at the edge of despair, but also clarity. She had nothing left to lose but her children, and that realization would push her toward a decision so dangerous, so unthinkable, that it would define her place in history. Each time Sallie Crane ran, the heaviest chain was not on her wrists. It was the knowledge that her children remained behind. Slavery ensured that escape was never a clean break, especially for mothers. Sallie could flee the plantation, but she could not carry her children with her without slowing herself, exposing them to capture, or risking their immediate punishment. Leaving them was not abandonment. It was the most painful calculation she was forced to make. While Sallie was gone, her children lived in a world of uncertainty and fear. They were vulnerable, not just to hunger and harsh labor, but to retaliation meant to punish their mother. Enslavers often used children as leverage, increasing their workload, withholding food, or threatening sale to break a parent's will. Even in her absence, Sallie's resistance followed them like a shadow. For Sallie, Every mile of freedom was haunted by images of her children calling for her. At night, hiding in forests or abandoned structures, she would have imagined their faces, wondering if they were crying, if they were being hurt, if they still believed she would return. That psychological torment was part of slavery's design to make love itself a weapon. When she was recaptured, the reunion would have been devastating. Her children may not have recognized her immediately, her body changed by punishment, her spirit hardened by survival. Yet those reunions also reinforced what slavery could not erase: the bond between mother and child. Even in brief moments stolen between labor and supervision, Sallie reassured them, teaching them endurance through presence alone. Over time, Sallie began to understand the terrible truth. As long as her children remained enslaved, she would never truly be free. And as long as she remained enslaved, they would always be in danger. The system had trapped them together in suffering, but it also gave her purpose. The children left behind were not just victims of the story, they were its driving force. Every escape, every beating, every act of defiance traced back to them. They were the reason Sallie Crane would make her most dangerous choice, yet not to flee alone again, but to challenge the system directly for the lives of her children. By the time Sallie Crane attempted her third escape, she was no longer running on hope. She was running on resolve. 2 failed attempts had taught her the price of freedom, and she had already paid it in blood, scars, and suffering. This time, escape was no longer an act of desperation. It was an act of strategy, shaped by everything she had endured. Sallie understood that the plantation system now viewed her as dangerous. She was watched more closely, punished more harshly, and spoken of in whispers as uncontrollable. Any mistake would be fatal. So she waited, she observed patrol routes, learned which overseers drank too much or slept too deeply, memorized the rhythm of the land. Survival had made her patient. When she finally ran, it was under conditions designed to erase her trail, perhaps during heavy rain, or when the plantation's attention was focused elsewhere. She traveled light, knowing speed mattered more than comfort. Every sound meant danger, every shadow a possible captor. The forests and swamps that once terrified her had become familiar allies. This third escape was different in another crucial way. Sallie no longer intended to disappear forever. She was not running from slavery, she was running through it, toward a future that still included her children. Whether she sought help from abolitionist networks, free black communities, or sympathetic individuals, she was now gathering something more powerful than distance, options. Against all odds, Sallie survived longer than ever before. Each day she remained free was a defiance of a system built to erase her. And in that fragile space between capture and freedom, something shifted. For the first time, escape did not end in immediate failure. The third escape proved what the enslavers feared most: Sallie Crane could not be broken. She had learned, adapted, and endured. And her danger still followed her. This final flight set the stage for the most extraordinary choice of all, one that would redefine what freedom meant, not just for her, but for her children. Freedom, when it finally came within reach, did not bring Sallie Crane peace. It brought clarity and an unbearable choice. After surviving her third escape longer than ever before, Sallie stood on the edge of something she had dreamed of for years: the possibility of living beyond chains. But freedom, without her children, felt hollow, almost cruel. Every breath she took in safety was shadowed by the knowledge that her children were still enslaved. Sallie understood the truth few could face. Once she crossed fully into freedom, returning would be nearly impossible. Slave catchers would be waiting, Her description would be circulated. If she was caught again, death or permanent separation from her children was likely. Yet doing nothing meant accepting a different kind of death, the loss of her children's future. This was not a reckless decision. It was deliberate and terrifyingly rational. Sallie knew the risks better than anyone. She had already survived what the system used to destroy people. She had endured punishment meant to erase hope, and it had failed. Now, she chose to gamble her own life for the only freedom that mattered to her, the freedom of her children. Returning meant stepping back into the heart of danger. It meant trusting her strength, her knowledge, and her will against an entire system designed to crush her. She would have to move carefully, quietly, possibly pretending submission while planning rescue. Every moment back in Alabama carried the risk of betrayal or recognition. What makes this decision extraordinary is its clarity. Sallie did not return because she believed the system would show mercy. She returned because she refused to accept a freedom built on abandonment. In doing so, she redefined courage, not as escape, but as confrontation. This choice marked the emotional core of Sallie Crane's story. It transformed her from a fugitive into a protector, from a survivor into a challenger of slavery itself. And in choosing to go back, Sallie proved that a mother's love could drive a person to walk willingly into the very nightmare she had already escaped, if it meant saving her children. For fugitive mothers like Sallie Crane, escape was far more perilous than it was for most. Slavery punished resistance, but it targeted motherhood. A woman who ran was not just seen as property lost, she was seen as a threat to the system's future labor force. Her children represented value, control, and leverage, and that made her dangerous. The moment Sallie was identified as a repeat escapee, her life entered a category of extreme risk. Notices would have described her in detail, her height, complexion, scars, even the way she walked. Rewards increased with each attempt. Slave catchers were relentless, knowing a mother might return for her children and could be trapped that way. Freedom was no longer just distant, it was actively hunted. If captured again, the punishment for a fugitive mother was often final. Some were sold far south, deliberately separated from their children forever. Others were imprisoned, mutilated, or executed under the justification of discipline. Mercy was rare. Survival was never guaranteed. Even while free, Sallie would have faced constant danger. She could not trust strangers. She could not remain in one place too long. Every knock, every unfamiliar voice could signal betrayal. Free black communities and abolitionist allies existed, but helping a fugitive mother risked violent retaliation. Anyone who aided her placed their own life in danger. Returning for children multiplied those risks. Children could panic cry or be recognized. One mistake could expose everyone involved. Slaveholders anticipated such attempts, sometimes moving children or spreading false information to lure mothers back into capture. What makes Sallie Crane's survival extraordinary is not just that she escaped, but that she navigated a world where every instinct to love, protect, and return was turned into a trap. Motherhood, which should have been her refuge, was weaponized against her at every step. And yet, despite these dangers, Sallie pressed forward. Each risk she took was measured against a single truth: danger was unavoidable, but surrender was impossible. In choosing to act as a mother first and a fugitive second, Sallie Crane challenged the most ruthless logic of slavery and lived to leave her mark on history. Sallie Crane left behind no monuments, no official records celebrating her courage, but her legacy is carved into history through defiance itself. In a system designed to erase individuality, memory, and resistance, Her repeated escapes were acts of open rebellion. She proved that slavery could dominate bodies, but it could never fully conquer will. What makes Sallie's legacy extraordinary is not just that she ran, but that she returned. 3 times she defied a system that relied on fear and finality. Each escape challenged the myth that enslaved people accepted their fate. Each return exposed a truth slaveholders feared most, that love, especially a mother's love, could outlast terror. Her story represents countless enslaved women whose resistance was never recorded. Mothers who hid children, delayed overseers, sabotaged labor, whispered survival into young ears, and made impossible choices in silence. Sallie Crane stands for all of them. Her life reminds us that resistance was not always loud or armed. Sometimes it was walking back into hell because leaving someone behind was unthinkable. Through Sallie, we understand that freedom was not a single moment or destination. It was a process, one that demanded sacrifice, patience, and unimaginable courage. Her defiance weakened the system not by overthrowing it outright, but by refusing to let it define the limits of her humanity. Today, Sallie Crane's story endures as a reminder that history is not only shaped by those in power, but by those who refused to be broken by it. Her resistance was personal, maternal, and relentless, and because of that, it echoes far beyond Alabama's plantations into every story of survival, courage, and love that refused to disappear.